Steve Harvey. Silence by Caroline's tearful confession about faith and failure. When Caroline Leavitt stepped onto the Steve Harvey show, no one expected what came next. She looked composed, poised, the youngest White House press secretary in history. Steve, in his familiar suit and warm smile, welcomed her with the ease of an old friend. But the moment she sat down, her eyes caught the small cross hanging from his chest. She paused. The lights dimmed slightly. The room, once buzzing with applause, grew still. Then she spoke. "Steve, I want to thank you. Not just for today, but for something I've never said out loud." Steve leaned in. "I was at my lowest. I had just lost a race I gave my whole heart to. The media tore me apart, and one night alone in my parents' living room, I turned on the TV. There you were talking about faith, about not giving up, about how if you're still breathing, God's not done with you." She swallowed hard. That night changed everything. Steve blinked. His hand touched the cross unconsciously. This wasn't just another interview. It was a moment of truth, born not from politics, but from grace. Caroline Leavitt walked onto the stage of the Steve Harvey show with a calmness that didn't match her age. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She came with something deeper, purpose. The studio lights beamed warmly, casting a soft glow. Steve Harvey stood at the center, smiling, a familiar presence to millions. But this time, even he sensed something different. Caroline stepped forward, dressed in a modest blue suit, hair pulled back, eyes alert but kind. She took her seat across from Steve, who greeted her with his usual warmth. But the moment she sat down, her eyes shifted to his chest, to the small silver cross he wore. She paused. The air changed. The studio grew quieter. It wasn't planned, it wasn't scripted, but it felt sacred. "Steve," she said softly, "before we begin, I want to thank you. Not just for having me here, but for something I've never shared publicly." Steve blinked, surprised. He leaned in, curiosity on his face. "After I lost my congressional race," she continued, "I didn't just lose an election. I lost my footing, my sense of worth. The media was brutal. People said I was too young, too inexperienced, not ready." Her voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. The pain was clear in her calm. "I went back home to New Hampshire. I was in my parents' living room. Rain against the window, and I felt completely alone. I had nothing left in me. No ambition, no plan. I wasn't even sure I had a future in public service." Steve's smile faded. He listened. Caroline looked down for a moment, then met his eyes. "I turned on the TV. I wasn't even watching. I just needed noise. And then there you were. It was a segment where you weren't joking, you were speaking. And you said something I can't forget. If you're still breathing, God's not done with you." She paused, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Steve, those words didn't just comfort me. They pulled me up. They reminded me that failure didn't mean finished. That moment, it brought me back to life." The audience was silent. Steve looked at her, deeply moved. "I never knew," he whispered. "You couldn't have," she said, "but I think God did." The moment felt heavy, not with sadness, but with meaning. It was no longer a TV interview. It was a moment of shared faith, a passing of strength from one generation to another. Caroline straightened up. "After that night, I started writing again. Planning. I found new energy, a new focus, and I realized that I didn't lose that race to stop. I lost it to understand who I was really meant to serve." Steve leaned in, his fingers grazing the cross. "Who?" "Young people," she said simply. "The ones no one bets on, the ones from small towns, the ones without connections or money, just potential. I knew I had to do something for them." Steve smiled, a proud, emotional smile. "What did you do, Caroline?" She held her head high. "I drafted a new initiative. It's not official yet, but it's coming. A White House program. It's called the Next Generation Opportunity." The audience stirred. "It's designed to create real chances for youth who are overlooked. Mentorship, internships, leadership development, not based on who they know, but who they are." Steve shook his head, amazed. "And you're telling me that came from something I said?" "Yes," she said, "and from something you wear. That cross on your chest. It reminded me of my grandmother's. She passed last year. She always said, when you don't know what to do, pray, and if God feels silent, listen harder. Steve placed a hand over his heart. Your grandma sounds like she was a wise woman. She was, and she'd have loved you. Steve chuckled, but there was water in his eyes. Caroline, he said, voice thick with emotion, you just gave me the greatest gift anyone ever has. You showed me that what I do matters. She nodded. It matters more than you know. He looked around the audience. You see, folks, he said, we never know who's listening. We never know who's watching. But when we speak truth from the heart, it doesn't disappear. It lands where it needs to. He turned back to Caroline. You landed here, she said, right when I needed it most. He stood slowly. Caroline stood with him. No one in the audience clapped. Not yet. They were still breathing it in. Steve reached out and took her hand. Thank you, he said. No, Caroline replied, her voice warm and firm. Thank you for helping me breathe again. The lights dimmed, not for drama, but to let the moment settle. They stood together, a young public servant and a seasoned host. Different paths, same purpose. And somewhere between their silence and shared faith, a seed of hope had been planted. The story was just beginning. The studio remained quiet long after the lights dimmed. No music played. No audience member reached for a phone. It was as if the entire room held its breath, unsure whether the spell would break if anyone moved. Steve Harvey slowly let go of Caroline's hand, but his gaze lingered. He sat back down gently, motioning for her to do the same. As they both settled, he glanced at the cross resting against his chest, as if rediscovering its weight. Caroline, he said, his voice a little rough, I don't know how to follow that. But I need to ask, where did you find the courage to keep going? Caroline smiled gently, a small gesture full of gratitude. It came in pieces. That night I heard your words. It planted something, but the courage, it came slowly, from my family, from prayer, from showing up even when I didn't want to. Steve nodded. Showing up. That's half the battle. She leaned forward, earnest. It's more than that. When I went back to work, I didn't walk in with confidence. I walked in with conviction. I told myself even if the critics were right about my age, they couldn't be right about my worth. The audience listened intently. Her words weren't flashy. They were honest. Caroline continued. I started listening more. I looked at every quiet intern, every overlooked resume, and I thought, what if we stopped judging kids by where they come from and started seeing them for where they could go? Steve tapped his chest. That sounds like something my mama would say. Caroline chuckled softly. Sounds like something my grandmother would have embroidered on a pillow. The crowd laughed gently. It broke the tension just a little. Steve's voice grew quiet again. You said something about a policy. Next generation opportunity. Caroline nodded. It's still in development, but the idea is simple. Find the overlooked. Support them. Guide them. Don't just give them jobs, give them belief. Steve leaned back, visibly moved. You know how powerful that is. Caroline looked down at her bracelet. I do now. Then she looked up. But Steve, it's not just about a program. It's about a message. The same one you gave me. We don't have to wait until someone's at rock bottom to remind them they matter. The camera zoomed in on Steve's face. He blinked slowly, clearly, trying to keep his emotions in check. He nodded. You said earlier I was speaking truth, but you're turning it into action. Caroline met his eyes. Because you did first. Steve laughed gently, brushing a tear from his cheek. I'm just a guy who tells jokes and prays in his dressing room. No, she said. You're a man who gave someone like me the strength to rise. They both sat still for a moment. The air was thick with connection, with legacy. Steve finally turned to the audience. Look, he said, I don't care how old you are, how young. If you feel like you've been passed over, written off, forgotten, listen to what this young lady just said. There's still purpose in your breath, Caroline added softly, and there's still time to become who you were made to be. A few audience members wiped tears. A man in the third row bowed his head. Steve turned back to Caroline. So where do you go from here? She took a deep breath. I keep fighting for this initiative. I speak to the president's team. I meet with education leaders. And I try to live out the message that helped me stand again. He nodded. And what's that message? She looked straight into the camera. If you're still breathing, God's not done with you. The audience finally applauded, slowly, then louder. Not for performance, but for truth. Steve stood again. Caroline rose beside him. This time they didn't need to say anything. Their presence side by side said it all. One voice can change a life, and one life can light the way for a generation. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The applause faded, but the impact lingered. Caroline and Steve sat once more, the atmosphere still steeped in reverence. It wasn't a segment anymore. It was something between testimony and turning point. Steve cleared his throat, visibly moved but composed. Caroline, you said something earlier that stuck with me. That you didn't walk back into work with confidence, but with conviction. Caroline nodded slowly. Confidence can be shaken. Conviction is rooted. It doesn't rely on applause or approval. That's what I learned from watching you. Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Let me ask you something real. Not political, personal. How do you handle the days that still feel heavy? Caroline paused. Then she smiled a little sadly. I returned to the living room. He raised an eyebrow. Not physically, she clarified, but in my mind. That moment I first heard you, that stillness, that prayer in the silence. I go back there. It grounds me. Steve tapped his fingers together. We all need a place like that. Mine was the back seat of a 1976 Ford Tempo. The audience chuckled warmly. Steve grinned. I prayed so hard in that car the windows fogged up. Not from weather, just tears. Caroline's eyes glistened. And now look at you. He shrugged. It ain't about me anymore. It's about what I do with what I've been given. That's what you're doing now. Caroline sat back, her voice strengthening. That's the foundation of the next generation opportunity. It's not charity, it's legacy. Investing in people before the world tells them they're worthless. Steve nodded. Say that again. It's legacy, she repeated, and it's urgent. Steve stood up slowly, pacing a little, as if the words stirred something in him. You know, I think we forget sometimes this country wasn't built by the perfect. It was built by people who failed and kept going. That's what you're tapping into. Caroline leaned forward. Exactly. And it starts with reminding young people they are seen, they are known, and they are capable. Steve turned to the audience. Y'all hearing this? Murmurs of agreement. Then from the back, a woman's voice, we hear her. Caroline smiled gently. Steve chuckled. You've turned my show into a revival meeting. I just want people to know they're not alone, Caroline said. Steve pointed at her. There it is. That's the message, that's the moment. Caroline continued, her voice more determined. And it doesn't take fame or politics to make a difference. It takes presence. Showing up, listening, and believing even when others don't. Steve's eyes softened. You ever doubt you're enough? She took a breath. Yes, but I doubt the doubt now. The audience erupted in soft applause. Steve grinned. I need to write that down. Caroline laughed lightly. It's not mine. It's just something I learned along the way. Steve sat again, quieter now. You said something earlier that this wasn't just about you. That it's about something bigger. She nodded. Yes, because when I stood up again, I realized I wasn't just standing for myself. I was standing for every girl who's told she's too young. For every small-town kid with big dreams and no roadmap. For every voice that shakes the first time it speaks. Steve's voice trembled slightly. You know, I've stood on this stage for years, hoping people would laugh. But today I'm just grateful they're listening. Caroline looked around the room. They're listening because you taught them how. You made space for stories like mine. He nodded, deeply moved. We need more of those. And we need more people willing to listen, she added. A pause. Steve turned serious again. Caroline, where do you want this initiative to go? Her response was immediate. To schools, to rural towns, to inner cities, to community centers, anywhere a young person feels forgotten. We partner with local leaders. We create mentorship bridges. We build a national movement grounded in personal transformation. Steve leaned back, clearly impressed. And what do you need? She smiled. Champions, partners, and people who believe that hope is worth fighting for. Steve clutched the cross again. You've got one right here. The audience erupted, but it wasn't about claps. It was a rising wave of agreement. Caroline looked at him, eyes bright with gratitude. That's all I ever hoped for. Steve stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, you're witnessing more than a conversation. You're witnessing the planting of something sacred, a bridge between pain and purpose. And Caroline Levitt is holding the torch. The lights dimmed again, not out of routine but reverence. The torch had been passed, and the room still breathing, still believing, still ready to walk forward. As the lights brightened gently, the moment shifted from stillness to quiet determination. Steve remained standing, moved beyond words, while Caroline turned slightly to the audience, her face calm, but her eyes fierce with purpose. Steve broke the silence. Caroline, you've lit a fire in here, but what does it mean outside the studio? She took a deep breath. It means walking into hard spaces. It means staying when you want to quit. It means fighting for the invisible kids in forgotten towns and crowded cities. Steve nodded solemnly. That's real talk. But I know from my own story there's always pushback, always critics. How do you handle that now? Caroline smiled, but it was a tired smile. There's no shortage of criticism. Every time I speak, someone questions my age, my experience, my place. But I think of you, Steve, and I think of my grandmother, and I remember that truth doesn't need permission to be spoken. It just needs to be said. Applause rose, slow, steady, sincere. Steve sat down again. I want to hear how you got back up after that loss. From a congressional defeat to working in the White House. That ain't a small jump. Caroline's face softened. It wasn't quick. I took time. Time to be still. Time to cry. But also time to remember who I was before the cameras and speeches. I went home. I cooked with my mom. Walked with my dad. Listened to the trees, the wind. And one day I woke up and said, it's not over. The audience sat rapt. She continued. Then I started asking what would I do if I could rebuild. And the answer was simple. I'd serve, not myself, but the next generation. So I called old mentors, reached out to the team I used to work with. I told them, I'm ready to show up again. Steve leaned forward, and they welcomed you back. Caroline nodded, with questions, but also with grace. The president's senior advisors said, we see something in you. And I said, I see something in them, the young ones who aren't in the room yet. That's when the idea for the initiative started. Steve smiled. That's powerful. But I want folks to understand something deeper. This ain't just about a policy. This is personal. Caroline turned to the audience. Yes, because the best policy starts with pain. Mine came from losing. Yours might come from grieving, struggling, or even being overlooked. But all of us carry something worth transforming. She held out her hand, palm up. This is what pain becomes when we don't run from it. It becomes purpose. A murmur of agreement filled the room. Steve whispered, say that again. Pain becomes purpose. Caroline paused, but only if we give it permission. Steve touched his chest. I needed that. Then Caroline shared something new. There was a moment weeks after that night in my parents' living room when I almost gave up again. I'd applied for a local leadership role, just something small. They said no. Said I was too young. Again. Steve frowned. That had to sting. She nodded. But that night I remembered your voice again, and I said to myself, if Steve Harvey can sleep in his car and still rise, I can take one more no. The audience clapped gently, not for her pain, but for her resolve. Steve spoke with intensity. You turned your lowest moment into a ladder. Yes, she said, and I want every young person watching to know your valley isn't the end. It's the start of your climb. Steve stood again, fired up. You hear that your valley is the start of your climb. Caroline rose beside him. And when you climb, she said, bring someone with you. A full standing ovation, not for fame, for faith. Steve and Caroline stood side by side, no script, no prompts, just two voices echoing the same truth from different journeys. Steve wiped his eyes. You've got a room full of people ready to carry this torch. What would you say to someone out there, 40, 50, 60 years old, thinking their time to help is gone? Caroline turned eyes serious. I'd say this legacy doesn't wear a watch. You can begin it at any time. You are not too late. You are right on time. Gasps, a few tears. You can mentor, she continued. You can show up for one young person. You can say, I believe in you. That alone can reroute a life. Steve nodded, just like it did for you. Exactly, she said. The world changes when we take our stories and use them like bridges. The camera panned slowly over the crowd, many wiping their eyes. Steve placed a hand on her shoulder. You're a light, Caroline. Caroline placed her hand over his. You were mine first. And the room once again fell still, not in silence, but in sacred recognition. They weren't watching a talk show anymore. They were watching hope unfold. The audience had returned to their seats, but the spirit in the studio had not settled. There was something sacred in the air now, something that didn't disappear when the clapping stopped. It lingered like the scent of a candle long after the flame is out. Steve looked at Caroline again. You said you were ready to show up. But when did you realize that what you were building was bigger than a second chance, that it was a calling? Caroline hesitated, then answered with a quiet strength. It hit me when I visited a high school in rural Pennsylvania. We were talking to a group of seniors about civic engagement. And one girl, maybe 17, stood up and asked, "Do you think people like us will ever matter in Washington?" The studio was silent. I looked at her. Caroline continued, and I saw myself. That moment I had doubted everything. And I told her the truth. You already matter. You don't need DC to tell you that. But when I left, I knew that wasn't enough. She needed more than a sentence, she needed a system. Steve nodded. So that's when the policy took root. Yes, she said. I realized we weren't just talking about youth support, we were talking about generational healing. Giving young people something to belong to, something that reminds them their voice matters before the world ever affirms it. Steve leaned in. Tell me what this initiative looks like in action. Caroline took a breath. It looks like mentorship pipelines in communities that have been left out. Apprenticeship programs for kids who aren't heading to college. Grants for youth-led startups. Partnerships with faith-based and local organizations that already have trust on the ground. It's not just government, it's family. Soft applause rippled. She continued. And it's also about listening. We go in asking, what do you need, not what can we give. We build with them, not for them. Steve smiled. That's wisdom beyond your years. Caroline looked down for a second. It's not my wisdom, Steve. It's the result of failing listening and trying again. I just kept showing up. Steve turned to the audience. That's the key, folks. Keep showing up. He paused. Caroline, he said gently, what's been the hardest part so far? Caroline's eyes misted. Carrying stories that aren't mine. Hearing from young people who've been abandoned, hurt, overlooked. I cry after almost every school visit. Not because I feel pity, but because I feel responsibility. Steve lowered his voice. And how do you carry that without breaking? I don't always, she admitted, but faith helps, and community, and remembering the light I saw in you. I think if Steve could keep going when the world gave him no reason to, so can I. Steve covered his mouth, visibly moved. You know, he said, some folks think TV is just entertainment. But today we're building something. Caroline nodded. Yes, we're building belief. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Caroline spoke again. There's one story I haven't shared yet. One that changed how I see this mission. Steve turned to her eyes, narrowing gently with curiosity. It was in Chicago, she began. A boy named Isaiah. He was quiet. Barely spoke during the session, but after he slipped me a note. I read it that night in the hotel. It said, "Thank you for talking to me like I'm somebody. Most people don't." A hush swept the room. Caroline wiped a tear. That's when I knew. We aren't just shaping policy, we're saving dignity. And if we do that right, just maybe we're saving lives. Steve whispered, yes, you are. He stood again. The weight of the moment demanded it. Caroline stood with him. Caroline, he said, voice steady but soft. What can this audience do to help you carry this? Caroline looked around. Be a voice. Share this story. Mentor someone. Write to your local leaders. Start something in your own town. Most of all, don't underestimate the power of belief. One voice saved me. Yours. Be that voice for someone else. The audience nodded. A wave of quiet yeses echoed. Steve turned back to the camera. You heard her. This isn't politics. This is purpose. And we all have a part. Caroline smiled. This isn't about the White House. It's about your house, your neighborhood, your faith, your hands. Steve closed his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and spoke the words that felt like an echo from the beginning of the journey. If you're still breathing, God's not done with you. Caroline stepped beside him. And if you're still believing, she said, you're already part of the change. Together they looked into the camera, not to perform, to invite, and the invitation was simple. Keep going, keep building, keep showing up. Because someone out there is waiting for your voice to reach them. And when it does, it might just save their life. They stood in that truth, together, and the studio held it with them, until it wasn't just a show, it was a movement, and it had just begun. As the stage lights dimmed slightly, a golden hue fell over the studio. The crowd, though seated again, felt transformed. No one reached for their phones. No one whispered. It was the kind of silence you hear when something sacred is unfolding. Steve turned to Caroline. You've been the spark, the voice, the vessel of something bigger. But what now? Caroline didn't hesitate. Now we build. He raised his eyebrows. Build what? Bridges, she said. Bridges between generations, between leaders and learners, between faith and future. The next generation opportunity isn't just a program, it's a promise. Steve nodded slowly, visibly moved. And how do we make good on that promise? We start by going deeper, Caroline explained. We don't stop at headlines or hashtags. We go into homes, schools, churches, barbershops. We talk, we listen, we act. The audience murmured in agreement. Caroline continued. In 2 weeks, we launch regional roundtables across the country. Young people, faith leaders, local educators, all invited to shape what comes next. Steve smiled. You're making government human again. Caroline looked around the studio. I'm making hope public. A man in the front row whispered amen. She turned back to Steve. And we'll have a digital platform anyone can join, anyone can mentor, anyone can bring an idea forward. This isn't mine, it's ours. Steve looked to the audience. This is how movements are born. Not with fireworks, but with faith. Caroline took a breath. And faith is action. The camera zoomed in, slowly capturing the moment. Steve's hand was once again on the cross. You know, Caroline, he said, I've had a lot of people on this stage. Celebrities, politicians, athletes. But today it feels like I've met a prophet. Caroline shook her head, humble. I'm not a prophet, just a girl who got up again. Steve laughed softly, eyes glistening. That's exactly what prophets are. The crowd erupted in soft applause. Then Steve stepped forward, his voice rising. I want everyone watching to do something right now. Think of one young person, just one who needs to hear, you matter. Text them, call them, write them. Don't wait. Do it today. He turned to the camera. Because the world won't change from studios or speeches. It'll change in kitchens, in living rooms, in quiet car rides, one voice at a time. Caroline added, and if you're that young person watching, let me be the one to tell you you are enough. Right now, as you are. You don't need permission to dream, just a reason to believe. A woman in the third row sobbed quietly. Steve took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. Caroline, if there's one message you want the world to remember from today, what would it be? She looked into the camera. That the light you're waiting for might already be inside you. Don't wait for someone to rescue you. Become the reason someone else gets up. The studio sat stunned. Caroline stepped closer to Steve. You were my reason once. Now I want to be that for someone else. And I hope we've just passed that torch again today. Steve's voice cracked. You did more than that. You started a fire. She smiled. Then let's keep it burning. Steve turned again to the crowd. I want us to close today with something different. No applause, no fanfare. Just a moment of unity. Close your eyes, think of someone who needs hope, and send that light their way. Silence swept the room. Hundreds of eyes closed, heads bowed. Some lips moved in silent prayer. Others simply breathed. And in that stillness, something powerful happened. The movement wasn't theoretical anymore. It was alive. When the lights came up again, Caroline looked at Steve. This isn't goodbye. It's just the beginning. He nodded. And the next chapter. She smiled. It's already being written. In every home, every heart, every whisper of hope. They hugged once more. A long, quiet embrace. Two souls connected not by career or fame, but by faith and purpose. As they pulled apart, Steve turned to the audience. Folks, we started with a story. We end with a mission. Now go out and be the reason someone still believes. Caroline raised her hand, and remember, you don't have to be perfect to be powerful. You just have to keep going. The credits rolled, but no one stood up. No one left early, because this wasn't entertainment. It was a calling, and every single person in that room had heard it loud and clear. If this story moved, you don't let it end when the screen fades to black. Subscribe to our channel to continue following powerful stories like Caroline's. Leave a comment and share who inspired you to keep going during your hardest moments. Like this video if you believe that one voice, one honest moment of faith can change a life. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, share it with them. Together we can build a movement of hope, one story, one person at a time.